I'm back in LA. Who's in the house? Remember when you comment right at the beginning of a Facebook Live broadcast, you signal to Facebook that we're doing something of value here. Where are you tuning in from? What are you thinking about? What is on your mind? What is your concern right now? What is your prayer for the community? Shabbos is almost here. Would you like to wish us a good Shabbos? There's so many different ways to come in and say something, but you got to put something in the comments right now to signal to Facebook we're doing something of value, and that way more people will be shown the show. That's how the Facebook algorithm works. I just got back to LA. I was in Boston and New York. Hello, Jocelyn Belfer says shalom. Randy Gallagher is in from Palm Springs. Nina's in the house. She's literally in the house. She's inside the house. I'm here in our office in the garage. Earlier today, I was by the Ohel of the Lubavitcher Rebbe, and you can see that post there on Accidental Talmudist, and it was very, very moving to be there. When you have a chance to pray to God, we don't pray to righteous people. We pray to God. But it's considered in our tradition that praying to God in the presence of the final resting place of a saintly leader, our prayers have a little bit of extra oomph. We know a little bit better what to pray for, and we can ask the souls of those righteous individuals to strengthen our prayers and perhaps even to pray for us and to convey our prayers. So it's very powerful being there by the Lubavitcher Rebbe. And if you see the post, I mentioned that I was going to be there, and I thought, maybe 30, 40 people might put a prayer in the comments, and then I would convey those prayers by the graveside. And I was there for a long time because it was about 250 prayers that I extended on behalf of members of our community. And thank you for giving me that opportunity to pray for you and to communicate your prayers while I was in that holy spot. It was very emotional and moving for me and helped me understand what's important and what to pray for. Tuning in with the prayers of others, praying for others. There's a tradition, we haven't encountered it yet in our Talmud journey, but it is in the Talmud that is more powerful to pray for another sometimes than it is to pray for yourself. And sort of, people pray for each other. That's a great way for everyone's prayers to be heard. But it makes sense, right? When we pray for ourselves, there's a certain bias, and a certain, we just want the outcome that we want. And when we pray for others, it's a little bit more selfless. And perhaps those prayers have a little bit more power for that reason. Cheryl Lanther in the house from League City, Texas. Bridget Crossland from Dallas. Sandra McMurray says thank you. Just people who said thank you. I think sometimes they were saying thank you to me for being there. I think some people were saying thank you to the Rebbe for all the work that he did. There really has not been too many individuals in the history of mankind more selfless than the Lubavitcher Rebbe, who never had a vacation, never really left New York, while he was acting as Rebbe for a community, and made it the business of the Chabad Lubavitch movement to send an army into the world and to be there for other Jews, right? He raised an army who are really selfless people. They're not in it for the money. They're not in it for the glory. They're not in it for the prestige. But everywhere a Chabad rabbi goes, he sets up a Chabad house so that a Jew can be anywhere in the world and have access to prayer, to learning, to warmth and hospitality and Shabbos dinners. They're just incredibly warm people. And in the college tour that I was just on with my daughter, we actually met several Chabad rabbis and Rebbitzins at the different campuses. And really, special shout out to them. It was beautiful. Chabad at Harvard, Chabad at Princeton, Chabad at Columbia. Where else were we? At Brandeis. We just had a really, really beautiful experience. So thank you to everybody. Lionel Leventhal in the house says, praying for others. I hadn't thought about it that way before until you said that, even though I prayed for lots of people. And Lionel, you and I Lionel and I were praying by the graveside of Rebbe Nachman in Uman, Ukraine, together a couple years ago. It was so great to be there with you, Lionel. And I'm sure you remember that we carried a bunch of prayers for our community while we were there. And of course, Nina and I did the same thing when we were by the Kotel. I've done that a couple times for the Accidental Talmudist community. And so anytime you get a chance to be a messenger for others, right? When you are a messenger for others, conveying their prayers to a holy place or bringing charity for them to someone who needs it, when you act as a messenger for a mitzvah mission, right? For you're helping somebody else fulfill a commandment by being their messenger. That's very elevated. That's a very elevated state to be in. And in fact, you're literally acting as a malach, right? As an angel. The word angel in Hebrew is the same word as messenger. And so you act as an angel when you are somebody else's messenger on a mitzvah mission. And our sages teach that you have an extra measure of protection when you're acting as somebody's messenger on a mitzvah mission. All right, this is AT Daily. We have been exploring in order the Talmud. We're going to Daf Yomi Cycle, the page of the day. We are on Berachos, the first volume of the Talmud, page 20. We're in chapter 3. We've been discussing situations in which there is an impediment to reciting the daily Shema that causes one to be exempt. So, for example, if you're in the presence of a dead body, right? There's a corpse right in there. It's different depending on whether you're just near the body or you're the relative of the deceased. So the exemption works differently, etc. And that's what we've been talking about. And then we ran into this idea that the eulogizers, the people who were close to the deceased, but not the relatives, they're not exempt from reciting the daily Shema while they're at the burial place, right? So they've come to the funeral, the burial. They cannot say the Shema while they're in the presence of the dead body, but since there's plenty of them there who can still bring honor to the deceased, kind of as individuals, they can slip away, so they're not in the presence of the dead body and not too near any other dead bodies if they're in a cemetery, and then they can fulfill their obligation reciting the daily Shema, unless they're seated in such a place that they'll have to climb over the family, the mourners who are really grieving, the family members, and they would impact negatively on the dignity, the human dignity of the mourner. And so there we see that the human dignity and the concern for people's dignity trumps certain mitzvah obligations. And that's what we're continuing to learn about now. Generally speaking, if you're going to humiliate or embarrass somebody, cause them, right, to impinge on their dignity. So even though you're fulfilling a mitzvah to do it, you're probably going to be exempt from doing that mitzvah. So now the question becomes, okay, well, is that a universal rule? Are you exempt from all mitzvahs just because you don't want to, impact on somebody's dignity? That's problematic because, when you're doing a mitzvah, so you're sanctifying the name of God, right? When you fulfill a commandment because God told you to do it, in this world. So in a sense, you're sanctifying the name of God in this world and you're helping prepare this world to be a home for God's presence. And so if you sort of say, well, to not hurt human dignity, I'm going to, just blanket exemption. Don't worry about it. Any mitzvah that you're going to do, you don't have to do it. That's too much because now you're impacting the honor of Hashem, right? Hashem's honor is involved. And you can't just leave God hanging while you're making sure that you don't embarrass anybody. So there's a bit of a balancing that goes with it. Still, most of the cases show that you have to go out of your way to not embarrass or humiliate any other person while you're fulfilling your own religious practice. As we learn about this, we see that, okay, so for example, there's something called shatnez, which is a forbidden mixture of wool and linen. A Jew is not permitted to wear clothing that has a mixture of wool and linen. I actually learned about this firsthand during last Passover. We were at a program in Toronto, and there was an outlet mall there, and I bought a beautiful Hugo Boss suit for such a good price, such a deal. I was so excited about my suit. And then I, got back to the dining hall, and there was a rabbi there who says, "Oh, Hugo Boss, famous for Shotnitz issues." I'm like, huh? What? But it's a wool suit. What do you mean? There's no linen in it. But apparently, like, the lining behind the lapel does have that forbidden mixture of linen and wool. Not all Hugo Boss suits, but some Hugo Boss suits. And then I learned about, but that's okay, because there's a guy, every city has one, and here in LA, I think it's called the Shotnitz Lab. And there's a guy that you take the suit to, and he checks it out, and if indeed you have the forbidden mixture, so he cuts it out. And then you can take it to a tailor who replaces that strip of lining behind the lapel with another piece of cloth, of the okay type of, cloth. And, it made the suit more expensive by the time I was done with the Shotnitz Lab and the tailor replacing that lining behind the lapel. But the point is, an observant Jew cannot wear that mixture. And there was a teaching in ancient times that if you see somebody wearing that, right, for their benefit, so that Jew should not, desecrate God's name in public by wearing this forbidden mixture, if it's like somehow obviously that forbidden mixture, so you can walk up and take it off him, right? You can take it off him. But how do you take it off him? So there was a case where this teaching was in place. It's not in place anymore, but it was in place then. And a pretty learned rabbi, one of the sages of that period, saw that a woman was wearing this mixture. She had other clothes underneath that part of the garment. He didn't take it off her and leave her naked. But nevertheless, in a public place, he walked up and took off this outer garment. And then explained to her why he was doing it. And that embarrassed her because it was public. And worse than that, it turned out that she wasn't Jewish. This is a commandment for Jews, not for non-Jews. So this rabbi was not only borderline embarrassing this woman in public, but turned out he was also wrong to do it because she didn't have to fulfill that commandment, even though it was in Israel. And the sages, his colleagues, fined him. They took him to court and fined him a large sum of money that he had to pay to her, sort of damages for, humiliation and suffering, as it were. He didn't damage the garment, but he still had to pay her because he did that. And then the teaching is brought down that, we're not holy enough to, in a public place, scold someone for not doing something properly. We're not holy enough to do that. Even sages are not holy enough to do that. You have to be very, very careful how you communicate to somebody else what they should or shouldn't do, and you must not negatively impact their dignity. So then examples are given of earlier sages who were holier. Now, this is a general teaching that we have in the Talmud, and it's quite opposite of the sort of general wisdom of our culture. Our culture believes, like American culture, Western civilization, modern culture, that people get wiser every year, right? Because science advances, so certainly the pool of knowledge in the world grows as new discoveries are made. So we feel like younger people are smarter than old people. Now think about that. In your heart that when you hear that, well, that doesn't make sense. Older people are carrying wisdom. They have the benefit of experience. They learned more. And that idea completely informs our treatment of learned people in the Jewish tradition. Not only, though, in terms of older people have more experience and wisdom than younger people, but earlier generations possessed more wisdom. They might have had less knowledge, but they possessed more wisdom and more sanctity, more holiness than later generations. Why? Because they were closer to the revelation at Mount Sinai. When scripture was given at Mount Sinai, when the Ten Commandments were given, sort of the closer we are in time to that giving, to that revelation, the more impact that sanctity had on those people. And as we get later away from that, even though we might have, many more centuries worth of commentary and the benefit of brilliant people who have lived and taught in the centuries since Torah was given, still there's this respect that we give those earlier generations. And in some ways, we see that it was proven, they were able to conduct themselves in ways that are no longer available. It's actually a joke like this, where there's two grandfathers on an airplane flying from, I think from Jerusalem to New York, right? And one of them is like a scientist, like a secular scientist, flying with his grandson, and the other is a rabbi, a Hasidic rabbi. We both have the long beards, but one is totally secular and one is very religious, and they're both flying with their grandsons. And the Hasidic rabbi, his grandson is very respectful and really doting on his grandfather, making sure that he's comfortable and getting up and walking down the aisle to get him water or coffee or a blanket or whatever he needs, and really treating the grandfather with respect. And the scientist, his grandson, is just like we all have been with young kids who are nagging kids. It's just, I want this and I want that and give me this and give me that and I want now and why not and why haven't we landed yet, etc. And eventually the scientist with the beard leans over to the rabbi with the beard and he says, I gotta say, I'm impressed with your grandson. He's a very respectful kid. He's got great values. What's the secret? How do you get your grandson to behave that way? I wish I could get my grandson to behave that way. The rabbi says, it's very simple. We've taught my grandson that every generation before him is a little bit closer to God's revelation at Sinai, and so worthy of respect and reverence, right? Older people are just a little bit closer to that great moment, and so have a little bit more holiness in them, and they respect that. You teach that, and you've taught your grandson that, we're all descended from apes. So every new generation is further away from being an ape, a savage primitive. So he thinks he's the best thing since sliced bread. Maybe it's funny, maybe it's not for you, but it is definitely a perspective, this reverence for earlier generations. And so here in this page of the Talmud, we have these two earlier rabbis who now later rabbis are looking at, and they conducted themselves in one area in a way that later rabbis are not permitted to do. Right? They were permitted, the early ones, and the later ones are not. What is it? These rabbis, Rabbi Yochanan and Rabbi Gidl, would sit near the women's mikvah. Now, women, once a month they have their time of the month, and while they're having their menses, they're not permitted to their husbands, right? The couple, the married couple, can't have relations when the woman is having her time of the month, and when the flow finishes, for 7 more days to make sure that it's completely done. And there's a lot of laws about that, and we'll encounter that much later in our Talmud journey. But once that's finished, the week of the flow, more or less, and then the 7 days, the clean days that she observes, then she goes to have a ritual immersion in this beautiful, the beautiful bathhouse, the waters of the mikvah. It's an extremely private thing. And, communities go out of thetheir way to make the mikvah super private so that women can go in, go out, and sort of never interact with anybody. And not talk to anybody, not be seen by anybody. It's very private. No one's business but hers, when she gets home, her husband. But these rabbis, Rabbi Yochanan and Rabbi Gidl, would actually sit near the women's mikvah as women were coming and going. They had 2 different reasons for doing it. Rabbi Gidl was teaching the laws of mikvah. Maybe in his town there was not, a woman. Normally women teach women the laws of mikvah, and maybe the woman wasn't available who would have been teaching the younger women these laws. And so he was making himself available to answer questions and teach those laws. And Rabbi Yochanan was known to be one of the most beautiful people who ever lived. He was just so handsome. And he was actually quite heavy. He was a very big man. But his face was so handsome and beautiful, and there was like a radiance about him. He was just naturally handsome, and his soul shone through. And there was just this like incredible attractive beauty to him. And women had a tradition that they liked to see Rabbi Yochanan's face on their way to the mikvah, because then they would, have this like sort of extra measure of holiness as they went in the mikvah, and then they would come out and go home to their husbands, and now they're, the couple is permitted to each other again. For what purpose? To be fruitful and multiply, right? To have kids, to make babies. And it was almost like it was like I don't know, call it a superstition or a bit of knowledge, a custom, that if a woman would see Rabbi Yochanan's beautiful face on her way into the mikveh, so she would have beautiful children, right? It was like a segula. It was a way to help them have beautiful children. Later rabbis look onto these practices of Yochanan and Gidel and say, yeah, we can't do that. Because if you're looking at women going into the mikveh, so that's going to make you think, licentious thoughts, and you're going to succumb, perhaps not in deed, maybe even in deed, but certainly in thought, to the evil inclination, and you're going to look at them, with lust, right? And have the kind of thoughts that especially a sage is not supposed to have. That you might succumb to the evil inclination, or you might attract the evil eye, right? I mean, Rabbi Yochanan sitting there and saying, look, you can look at me because I'm so handsome and that will help you. Now, they said it to him. They wanted him there. But still, that would go to somebody's head, right? Like, everyone thinks that he's so handsome that they need to look at him before they go to the mikveh so they'll make beautiful babies. That could attract the evil eye, and people would become jealous of him and want to curse him and attract all kinds of bad stuff, right? So it's like we're not worthy to conduct ourselves like these two guys did. But these earlier generations were sort of saintly and elevated enough that they could do those kinds of things and keep their purity and holiness and saintliness. So, right. I mentioned the Shatnitz, I mentioned those two rabbis. And in this idea of continuing this teaching about not being so careful about never harming somebody else's dignity. So we actually had an experience. We were once at a Shabbat lunch in Israel, and there were a lot of people there. We were having a fantastic time. And one of my kids, just like by mistake, could happen to anybody, sort of reached for something and spilled some grape juice onto their clothing, right? One of my kids spilled some grape juice onto the clothing. And it was like, they're nice Shabbos clothing, so the kids were like, oh no. And, they took like a napkin and put some water on it and started dabbing at the stain. So you can't do that on Shabbos because that's like doing laundry. That's one of the prohibited labors on Shabbos. So there was a guy nearby who knew that, well, you can't do that on Shabbos. And he saw somebody doing it, at a rabbi's house, at his Shabbos table. And he wanted to essentially protect the honor of God and protect the honor of the rabbi in his home, that somebody shouldn't be, violating this law, and even help out my kid so that he should know, or she should know. I'm not revealing which kid it was. That the child should know that you can't do that on Shabbos. But this guy made a mistake in how he did it. Fine to tell people, hey, you're not supposed to do that. But because he saw somebody dabbing at a stain at the table, he sort of just reacted too quickly and jumped out of his chair and said, no, you can't do that. And attracted attention from around the room onto the child, who was very embarrassed. Like, oh, I'm sorry, I didn't know, I didn't think, And that was a mistake. This fellow handled that wrong, right? Because you don't want to impact the dignity of anybody, not just an adult, but even a child, a minor, somebody, who lacks capacity to understand. In the old days, a slave. Anybody's dignity must be protected. So that's a teaching we get from this page in the Talmud. Okay. What else did I want to say? Okay, so we also encounter, while we're on the subject of who is obligated and who is not and at what time, so we've mentioned a few times that women have different obligations than men. So here we have a Mishnah on this page, on page 20 in Tractate Berachos, that goes directly to this. So women, slaves, and minors, right? It's not that they're equivalent to each other. Women are one kind of group, slaves are another kind of group, and minors are another. Slaves, by the way, this is the biblical definition of slaves, quite different than our common understanding of slaves. It's not somebody who's tortured in like a sweatshop. It's not, God forbid, like the African slaves who were brought across and whipped and made to work so hard on the plantations. There are obligations that in ancient Israel you could own slaves, but you had all kinds of sort of labor laws about what you can and can't demand of a slave. But at any rate, because a slave is sort of a full-time employee, their time is not their own. A minor doesn't have capacity to be obligated in certain things. And women had different obligations than men, largely because they were the primary caregivers for children. And because children could be so demanding, women, were exempt from certain obligations so that they would be free, to take care of kids and their needs at any time. So women, slaves, and minors are exempt from the daily recitation of the Shema, morning and evening. And they're exempt from tefillin, right? Men wrap tefillin. In non-Orthodox movements these days, some women wrap tefillin, but traditionally women are exempt from wrapping tefillin. And if they want to take on the obligation, they're discouraged. That's according to the Talmud in traditional times. So they're exempt from Shema and tefillin, but women, slaves, and minors are obligated in prayer, in mezuzah, and in grace after meals, just like adult men are, right? And this is kind of interesting because from here we start to get this principle which exists all over, that women, the basic exemption they have that men don't have is that they are exempt from time-bound positive commandments. So Shema is a time-bound positive commandment, meaning you have to do it morning and evening, and it's something you have to do. That's a positive commandment, as opposed to refrain from doing something, right? Like you're not allowed to, have sex. If you're married, you're not allowed to have sex with anyone who you're not married to. That's a negative commandment. You cannot have sex with those people. Negative commandments apply to everybody, right? On Pesach, you can't eat bread. That's a negative commandment, applies to everybody. So women are not obligated to say the daily Shema, but they are obligated to pray, which is interesting, and to pray at least once a day. Why? But at any time. They don't have, it's not a morning or evening thing. Women are just obligated to pray. Why? Because everybody needs divine mercy. Why mezuzah? Mezuzah is not time-bound. Just every doorway in the house has to have a mezuzah. And what about the grace after meals? That would seem to be time-bound because it's after the meal. But we're not told what time we have to eat. We are just told that we have to thank God for the food that we ate. So women have that same obligation as men. There is a little bit of a question whether the obligation for a woman to say grace after the meal is by rabbinic commandment or by Torah commandment, because that's a little unclear. Women are obligated to bench, to say the grace after meals when they've eaten bread, as in, it becomes a meal when you've had bread, but they can't fulfill that obligation for someone else. Sometimes you can be included in somebody else's grace. For whatever reason you can't do it yourself, they can't recite the grace for other people. Interestingly, women are obligated in Kiddush, right? So on Shabbat, we drink a glass of wine, Friday night and Saturday morning, and we make a blessing over that wine. And what we do, but the reason we make that is to sanctify Shabbat, right? We say a blessing over the wine only on Shabbat and holidays also, but here we're talking about Shabbat. And it's to set apart the day as a holy day. Now that is a time-bound positive mitzvah. Why are women obligated in Kiddush, unlike being obligated to say the daily Shema? Answer, it's in the Ten Commandments, right? You shall keep my Sabbath. You shall remember my Sabbath. Those two formulas are different. You shall keep or observe or guard the Sabbath day, right? And you shall remember the Sabbath day. Keep it, guard it to keep it holy, and remember it to keep it holy. It is, you will guard it, I think is the first time, right? Remember and guard. You will remember, right now I can't quite remember. The point is that the Ten Commandments are given twice in the Torah, in the book of Exodus and in the book of Deuteronomy. And when the commandment to keep Sabbath is given, the first time I think is remember, and the second time it's to guard and observe, to keep it, I might have got those two wrong. But the point is, I forget which is first, but definitely they're different, right? So at one point in the Ten Commandments, we're obligated to observe the Sabbath. That means that we refrain from doing work, right? All those laws about not working on the Sabbath and not doing laundry and not sewing and not wringing anything out, and you won't drive a car and you won't turn the lights on and off. All of that is observing or guarding the Sabbath. Remembering the Sabbath is saying Kiddush. Remembering the Sabbath is observing that, okay, this day is different, and we sanctify the day by saying the special blessing over a cup of wine. And because those two, both are given in the Ten Commandments, but it's a slightly different formula in the two versions of the Ten Commandments, a link is made between both of those obligations. And so everybody who's obligated in one, right, to observe the commandments, which is everybody, and refrain from doing work, those are all negative commandments, are linked to the positive commandment of sanctifying the day, right? And that's why women have an obligation to recite Kiddush if they're on their own, or to hear Kiddush if they're with the family. But because it's a little unclear how we get there, it's a rabbinic connection, so they can't make Kiddush for other people. They make Kiddush for themselves. Okay, and likewise with the grace after meals, which I just mentioned. Okay, so the takeaway from page 20, I think I've said it over and over during this AT Daily, so I'm going to say it one last time. Our takeaway is that we have to honor God, we have to sanctify God's name in this world, but if we get to a situation where for ourselves observing a commandment or helping others observe commandments, there's a possibility that we might embarrass or humiliate somebody publicly, so you can't do that, right? Human dignity trumps our obligations. You can quietly do it for yourself, right? You're not going to embarrass anyone by just slipping away and fulfilling your own obligation. But if you want to help somebody else fulfill theirs, you have to do that very, very light touch and never embarrass them publicly or even privately. Okay. Augusto Martin says, I always forget to say grace before, but just as I'm getting full, then the urge arises, so I give thanks to God. Right? Before, it's a bracha in the Jewish tradition. Grace is after the meal. It's a much longer thing. God is very nice that way. Right? The long thank you is after the meal. When you're starving, you don't have to say a long thing, but you have to say the little blessing, right? So you express gratitude right away that God gave you this food. And then at the end, the grace after meals is a much longer recitation. Thank you, my pals, for joining me for AT Daily. Shabbos is tomorrow. We're so excited. So I'll just wish you an early good Shabbos, a good Erev Shabbos. Erev Shabbos is the day before Shabbos. May you have a very sweet Shabbos. I'll do a show tomorrow morning from LA so that we can do page 21. With God's help, I'll get that done in the morning. Look for the Friday meme. We share that in the WhatsApp group. If you are on WhatsApp and you're not part of the WhatsApp group, so private message me with your number, and then I'll WhatsApp you, and you can add my number to your contacts, and then you'll receive the WhatsApp Shabbos greeting, which is that meme that I always share on Facebook, but I love also sharing it with the WhatsApp people. So if you're on WhatsApp, private message me your phone number. Just private message to Accidental Talmudist. If you are enjoying these classes and it's meaningful to you and you want to participate in the midst of sharing Torah with the whole world in a significant way, and by significant doesn't mean a lot of money, but donating to our nonprofit so that you are a partner in the transmission of this Torah all around the world and sharing the merit of that, one who enables others to learn Torah, it's a big, big merit to him. You'll be rewarded for that in this world and in the next for enabling others to learn Torah. So we'll put it in the header here, but you can always go to donate.accidentaltalmudist.org. The best is to sign up for a recurring payment. It can be small. $18 a month goes a long way. We have a lot of recurring donors, and they are our partners on an ongoing basis in sharing this Torah with the world, and they enjoy that merit. Donate.accidentaltalmudist.org. It's always great to share Torah with you. Sending you all big love from the West Coast.